think this is the moment when I can finally share my story with you. I didn't realize just how much trouble I'd stir up by distancing myself from my family, but here I am, almost 30, and my past is catching up to me. My younger fraternal twin and I had a rough start. Our parents had us later in life after years of fertility struggles, and they were convinced the entire pregnancy that I was going to be a boy. Turns out I wasn't, and the disappointment hit hard. The neglect that followed was like a constant weight on my shoulders, not to mention the emotional and financial abuse that piled up over the years. My parents were toxic, and to say they ruined my childhood and teenage years would be putting it lightly. I managed to escape at 18, finally getting out of that shithole. When I asked for my documents, things like my ID, social security card, they actually sent them along with a cease and desist letter, as if that was the final nail in the coffin. That was the last time I had any contact with them. But my estranged twin sister found a way to creep back into my life. She sent an email to my work account, which she shouldn't even know about because I changed my name when I turned 21. The email was filled with guilt-tripping nonsense about how we're twins, and everyone says twins should be close, followed by some passive-aggressive crap about inviting the family to my wedding. I had no idea how she found my email, and honestly, I started worrying about her mental state. Growing up, my sister knew she was the golden child and loved to make my life miserable. She used to hide her stuff in my room and then accuse me of stealing it, which would lead to our dad doling out punishment. It could be anything from locking me in the basement for days at a time, letting me out only for school or meals, to outright beatings. The worst incident happened when I was 17. She pushed me down the basement stairs, and I ended up with a broken arm, a concussion, and stitches in my head. My parents forced me to lie and say I fell so she wouldn't get in trouble. I left 2 months after graduation, thanks to my friends. Things stayed quiet for some time when my sister-in-law, Lisa, posted about my estranged family on her blog. Apparently, her followers convinced her it was her duty to mend the rift. That's when the emails from my sister escalated into angry phone calls and threats. I went to get a restraining order, but a cease and desist seemed like a quicker fix at the time. It worked for a bit, until it didn't. At a family dinner with my in-laws, Lisa decided to surprise me by announcing that she'd driven my twin to reconnect with me. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My husband immediately called the police, while my mother-in-law, who used to work with domestic violence victims, stepped in. The police escorted my sister straight to the airport and put her on a plane. Lisa defended my twin, insisting she'd never hurt me, which felt like a punch to the gut. After all the support I'd given her over the years, her betrayal cut deep. She's now ostracized from the family, and my husband told me I could decide when, if ever, I wanted to hear her apology. I've talked it over with my therapist, and I've decided not to send a letter to Lisa. I didn't want her turning it into sympathy fodder for her blog. Instead, I had sent her a cease and desist order, making it clear she was no longer welcome in my life. On a brighter note, the restraining orders against my parents and sister had finally been approved, but that didn't stop my sister from escalating her attempts to reach me. She was relentless, but I was done. After a few sessions with my therapist and starting a new anxiety medication, I finally sat down with my in-laws and my husband to talk through everything. It had been about 3 weeks, and I was starting to realize that it was perfectly okay for me to feel upset and take as much time as I needed to process everything. My therapist had been encouraging me to focus on my own healing instead of trying to keep everyone else happy. With that in mind, I've decided to cut off contact with Lisa for at least 6 months. My mother-in-law agreed it was the right move and a necessary step to show that her actions wouldn't just be brushed aside. However, when she passed this information on to the rest of the family, my husband's middle brother, who's pretty tight with Lisa, got angry. He shot me a text saying, "I don't understand why you're banning her from the holidays over something so small. This feels over the top and is going to make things difficult for the rest of us." My husband had been furious when he saw that. He sent out a group text to the entire family, letting them know we wouldn't be hosting the holidays that year. He also suggested that, with everything going on with COVID, it was probably a good time for everyone to take a break. He was determined to pull back from family for a while, and I was fully on board with the idea. My anxiety had been at an all-time high, and I just wasn't in an emotional place to deal with hosting. We figured someone would try to stop by and convince us otherwise, and sure enough, it happened. My husband's grandparents, who always spoiled Lisa, showed up unannounced. To make things more awkward, my husband had opened the door completely naked, holding a beer. They were disgusted and stormed off, accusing us of being the ones tearing the family apart. After that, we decided we were done with holidays involving them for good. I sent a long text explaining that, for once, I was choosing to focus on my own healing rather than being the forgiving doormat they'd come to expect. Lisa's actions had consequences, and I wasn't backing down this time. At the time, I was working as a midwife, mostly doing telehealth sessions because of the ongoing pandemic. Since one of my patients was nearing a critical stage of her pregnancy, I had been self-isolating to ensure I stayed COVID-free before heading back to the clinic. But a few days ago, things took an unexpected turn when my husband's grandparents showed up at my clinic, dragging Lisa along with them. Even though the clinic was closed, they pounded on the door for a good 10 minutes until one of the nurses finally came out, phone in hand, recording everything. We had signs up making it clear the clinic had audio and video surveillance for security reasons, which was all perfectly legal. The nurse politely told them we were closed and suggested they head to the hospital if they were dealing with a medical emergency. But my husband's grandparents weren't there for an emergency. They were there for me. They demanded to speak with me, and when they didn't get what they wanted, they actually called the police. The nurse, knowing this was nonsense, immediately reported it to the non-emergency line. Soon after, the police showed up. When the officers arrived, my grandparents-in-law explained they needed to apologize to me. The cops weren't amused and issued them a formal trespassing warning before sending them on their way. When my husband heard what happened, he was absolutely furious. He picked up the phone and tore into his grandparents, practically yelling at them. Their excuse? They claimed Lisa needed to apologize so that we could get back to being a family again. I took the phone from him and reminded them firmly that whether or when I saw Lisa again was entirely my decision. After that, my husband decided enough was enough. He blocked all of them from our phones, determined to give us the peace we desperately needed. We made a decision that day to focus on ourselves for the next year. My husband felt so guilty for his grandparents' actions, even though it wasn't his fault. Meanwhile, we were still in the thick of dealing with my parents and twin sister. The restraining order had been served, and surprisingly, my parents hadn't made a move, at least not yet. My twin, though, was a whole different story. She had begun spiraling, calling anyone who would listen and spreading wild rumors that my husband was abusing me. She had always lived in her own reality, but this was a new low, even for her. This morning started with an unwelcome surprise. Police officers knocking at my door. Despite the restraining orders we had in place against my parents and twin, my grandfather had decided to file a welfare check. He claimed that my husband was physically abusing me, keeping me locked inside the house, and verbally tearing me down every day. The officers made it clear right away that they didn't believe the story, especially since the so-called evidence came from my estranged twin, who wasn't even allowed to be involved due to the restraining order. We invited the officers in without hesitation. They walked through our home, met our cheerful dogs and adorable ducklings, and by the time they left, they were completely satisfied that everything was perfectly fine. They even filed a report to counter my grandfather's claims and reassured us we wouldn't have to deal with any more welfare checks because it was obvious the accusations were false. Our lawyer wasted no time sending a cease and desist letter to my grandfather, making it crystal clear that any further contact would bring serious legal consequences. We also handed over the latest unhinged text from my twin, which was full of her usual delusional ramblings. This time, she had crafted an elaborate story accusing my husband of keeping me hostage and abusing me. She even went so far as to describe me as malnourished, bruised, filthy, with a black eye and scratches on my arms. Not a single word of it was true, of course, but it was clear her grip on reality was slipping further. Later in the day, my aunt, the same one who had helped me escape all those years ago, sent me a batch of screenshots showing even more wild messages from my twin. In those messages, she was still insisting that I was being held against my will and that someone needed to come rescue me. It was exhausting to see, but not exactly shocking. I forwarded everything to our attorney. At this point, it was undeniable. My twins' lives were spiraling out of control, and it was only getting worse. A few days later, the situation took an even darker turn. The restraining orders had officially been served to my biological parents and twin. My parents, unsurprisingly, stayed silent. But my twin, she went off the rails. She started firing off messages to anyone she could reach, insisting that I was in immediate danger. The story she was spinning had become more extreme, claiming my husband had me trapped, that he was holding me hostage. She told them the police weren't helping because of the restraining order, painting herself as the hero in some dramatic rescue. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I found out my husband's grandparents had taken her side completely. They decided to take things a step further. Without warning, they showed up at my workplace with my twin in tow. Couldn't believe it. It was after hours. The clinic was closed. But instead of leaving quietly, they made a scene, pounding on the doors, shouting to be let in. They demanded to see me like they had the right. It didn't take long before one of the nurses, already fed up, called the police. When the officers arrived, my grandparents-in-law and twin tried to play it off, claiming they were just concerned family members trying to reconnect. As if that justified their behavior. The police weren't having it. They escorted them off the property and issued a formal trespassing warning. It was clear to us that enough was enough. My husband and I had reached our breaking point. He blocked his entire family from our phones, and we both agreed that we were done. We cut off communication with everyone who was toxic, refusing to let them drag us down any further. Meanwhile, our attorney stayed on top of things, gathering more evidence. My twins' lies were piling up, and it was obvious this was heading toward more serious legal action. The weight of it all was overwhelming. I felt drained to the core. Between the constant harassment from my own family and the relentless interference from my husband's relatives, it was becoming too much. I'd already increased my therapy sessions to 3 times a week, but even that wasn't enough to deal with the stress. I was exhausted mentally and physically, felt like there was no end in sight. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I woke up to another nightmare. My biological parents and twin had been relatively quiet after being served with the restraining orders. But out of nowhere, my grandfather called in a welfare check on me. He fed the police this wild story, saying my husband was physically abusing me, that I was being held against my will. The police, of course, found nothing wrong. They even played with our ducklings before filing a report that directly countered my grandfather's false claims. But that didn't put an end to the harassment. Not by a long shot. A few days later, my aunt, the same one who had helped me escape when I was younger, reached out to me with some unsettling screenshots. They were messages from my twin. She was spreading lies, telling anyone who would listen that my husband was abusing me, holding me hostage, and keeping me completely isolated. She'd even gone so far as to say she feared for my life. It was horrifying. Our attorney didn't waste any time and filed more documentation to protect us. Every day, it felt like we were building a case, brick by brick, preparing ourselves for the inevitable legal battle that loomed ahead. The lies, the manipulation, it was relentless. Then, things took a bizarre turn. My twin had a complete meltdown and ended up being admitted to a specialized clinic. Apparently, she'd made threats serious enough to land her there. It was clear she was spiraling mentally. But that wasn't even the strangest part. My biological parents, trying to cover their own tracks, suddenly shifted all the blame onto her. They acted like my twin had been solely responsible for all the abuse I'd endured. According to them, they were the innocent victims of her behavior, completely rewriting history in an attempt to save face. It was disgusting. I couldn't believe the audacity. They were willing to throw their own daughter under the bus, just to avoid taking responsibility for the years of abuse they'd inflicted on me. It was infuriating, seeing them twist the narrative so brazenly. But as much as their lies got under my skin, I knew I had to stay focused. I couldn't let them derail my healing. It didn't take long before I realized the situation with my twin was far worse than I had thought. She wasn't just admitted to the clinic because of a breakdown, there was so much more behind it. My biological parents had been abusing her for days. They denied her food, kept her from drinking water, and disrupted her sleep by waking her up at all hours, only to scream at her. And if that wasn't enough, they had even resorted to physical violence. When she tried to leave, they wouldn't let her go. Eventually, she made it to urgent care where everything came to a head. Her breakdown there led to her being taken to the hospital, and it was the staff, along with her doctor, who finally stepped in. They were the ones who reported the abuse and got the police involved. At this point, it hit me just how twisted my biological parents truly were. I had thought for years that I was the only one they had hurt, but now it was clear they were doing the same thing to my twin. It was sickening. I found out that charges were being prepared against them, and they could be facing serious jail time. That gave me a small sense of relief, but I knew better than to relax. Anything could still happen until the court process was finished. Meanwhile, my husband and I had been preparing for a major life change of our own. We had decided to move. Not just to a different state, but out of the country entirely. It was time to leave all the chaos behind and start fresh somewhere new, away from the toxicity. We didn't tell anyone about our plans. We quietly put everything in order, packed up, and left without a word. We had arrived in our new home country. I couldn't even begin to describe the sense of peace that had washed over me. We were staying with a friend for the time being, quarantining, and all of our animals were with us, healthy, happy, and settled. My husband had already started reconnecting with some old friends from the area, and I could see the stress that had been weighing him down for so long finally starting to lift. But back home, the drama wasn't completely over. My husband's family, especially his grandparents, were furious that we had left without telling them. They accused us of abandoning the family, claiming we had run off to start a family of our own without including them. For the first time in years, though, I didn't care what they thought. We were finally doing what was right for us, and I refused to feel guilty about it. As we eased into our new life, I could finally feel the chaos starting to fade, at least for us. But back home, the situation with my biological parents was continuing to spiral. My sperm donor had apparently had enough. He got his old job back, moved in with a friend, and kicked my egg donor out of his life entirely. Their marriage had been a mess for years, but it wasn't the years of abuse or neglect that finally drove him away. No, what crossed the line for him was her using my name to open credit accounts behind my back. The fact that she'd messed with my credit infuriated my grandfather and dragged their family name through the mud. That's what made him leave. It wasn't the beatings, the lies, or the way they forced me to cover for them. It was this. The irony wasn't lost on me, but honestly, by then, I was just glad to be as far away from the mess as possible. As expected, my egg donor completely lost control. She physically attacked my sperm donor, trying to claw out his eyes. She was arrested for assault, and when the police showed up, she turned her rage on them too. Now she's not only facing assault charges, but is also waiting for a psychiatric evaluation. It's safe to say she won't be walking free anytime soon. In the midst of all this chaos, another twist came to light. My grandfather, who had once sided with my parents, changed his stance. Once he saw how deep their lies and manipulation ran, he kicked them both out of his home. And if that wasn't enough, he rewrote his will, cutting my parents out completely and leaving everything to my aunt, the one who helped me escape years ago. It was a strange feeling, realizing I might finally be free. My parents were tearing each other apart. My twin was still locked up in a care facility. And now, even my grandfather had turned his back on them. It felt almost surreal, like after all this time, I might actually be done with them for good. Meanwhile, my husband and I were getting settled into our new country. We had started our IVF journey, focusing on building a future for ourselves. For the first time in a long while, things were finally starting to look up, and we could focus on what was next instead of what we were leaving behind. Just when I thought the chaos had finally quieted down, life had one more surprise in store. My sperm donor, after throwing my egg donor out of his life, made one last-ditch effort to crawl back into my grandfather's favor. He begged, pleading to be let back into the family. But it didn't change anything. My grandfather had already made his decision. He arranged for my twin to remain in a long-term care facility and prepared to move away from the family home to live closer to my aunt. My sperm donor? He was left completely on his own, with no one left to manipulate. The real kicker came when my sperm donor learned what my egg donor had been up to. Again, she'd been using my name to apply for rental properties and open credit lines. His fury was obvious, but it was far too late. My grandfather had already severed ties, and my egg donor was now facing a psychiatric evaluation and criminal charges for attacking the police. Their world was crumbling, and for the first time, they had no one to blame but themselves. Oddly enough, I felt a wave of relief. I wasn't part of their mess anymore. They were finally facing the consequences of their own twisted choices, and I was far away from it all. Meanwhile, my husband and I were building the life we had always dreamed of. We bought a beautiful home in our new country, somewhere that felt safe, somewhere we could finally breathe. Our IVF journey was moving forward smoothly, and for the first time in years, I found myself looking ahead without the weight of my past dragging me down. Every so often, I still hear updates from my aunt, though I've made the choice to shift my focus entirely toward my own happiness. My biological parents, my twin, and even my in-laws had shown me their true selves. I'd come to terms with the fact that I would never have the family I once hoped for. And that's okay. I have my husband, the possibility of children, and a new beginning in a place where we can finally start fresh. That, I've realized, is more than enough. Thanks for watching this emotional story of love, lust, and lies. Hope it touched your heart. If you enjoyed it, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a fresh story every day. Love to hear your thoughts in the comments, so feel free to share your experiences and tell your story.